So, welcome to UTOKing with Gregg. I'm with Professor Scott Jordan. You currently chair of the Department of Psychology, right, at Illinois State University.
Yes. hmm
He's got a long history in embodied cognition, fascinating stuff on eye movements and understanding the world. And then he evolves into wild systems theory. I was on a walk. I don't know what it was, 2-3 weeks ago. I hear John Vervaeke because I tune into my good friend John Vervaeke, and boom, I'm like, oh my gosh, there's somebody tracking entropy and complexification across a coherence perspective that gives us, well, meaning itself. And I was like, I got to talk to that guy. So here we are. Scott, welcome so much to the program.
Well, Greg, thank you so much for having me. I'm absolutely delighted to be here, and I look forward to talking to all things wild systems.
Lovely, lovely. So, I am a clinician. So what I like to do is I like to situate people in kind of their narrative and developmental narrative. Doesn't mean we need to go all the way back to the beginning, but I would like to hear a little bit about just kind of how you came to get interested in cognitive science, cognitive psychology, and then evolve into this wild systems view, and then we can riff off of that.
Sure. I'll start a story, and you should feel free to interrupt me at any point.
Okay,
So I started college as a freshman, wanting to save the world's teenagers. I had every intent on being a therapist. After about 2 or 3 years, I recognized that I wasn't volunteering for the suicide hotline. I wasn't doing the things that all the other undergraduates who were bound for clinical training were doing. Didn't understand why. And then I took a course on perception, which was a undergraduate research course.
Sure.
And I met Professor Wayne Hirschberger, who provided the questions that would provide me a career's worth of work. So it's at that point that I fell in love with the elegance of the brain. It's at that point that I fell in love with the philosophy of relational thinking. At that point in my career, in the guise of ecological psychology, the first real experimentalist in American psychology to introduce relational thinking, and we can talk more about that later.
Yep.
And honest to God,
that should afford us a good opportunity. Thank you.
Go.
A week.
You're absolutely right. And then I worked with Wayne, my master's and PhD, and at the time I was working with Wayne, there were two things that were forefront in my philosophical thinking. And that was anti-representation, so anti-computationalism in descriptions of cognition, and then which was consistent with the ecological perspective.
Right.
And then looking at what it is that organisms actually control, i.e., what is it that organisms keep stable?
Yep.
And if we're going to use a computational framework with the idea of input, computation, output, it turns out that organisms aren't controlling their output from that framework. What William Powers taught us is that they're controlling their input. And then what Bill Powers did so elegantly was show us how you can generate a system that is basically a nesting of input control systems. And so I actually got to go to these conferences over the border in Wisconsin once a year with William Powers and a whole bunch of people who were doing control systems. Rick Markin, the whole crew.
Oh man, that's great. That's really cool.
They were just such enriched, and it's in that space that I kind of grew as a scholar. I mean, all of us go through some level of imposter syndrome.
Yep.
And I could see myself over the years. I could see them gaining respect for my insight, and I could feel myself becoming part of a community of intellectuals, and it completely mattered. And so when
let me pause you there for just a sec, because this is a very rich thing. Okay. So light bulbs explode when I discover perceptual control theory. Okay. So just so folks are aware, all right, of what do we mean by perceptual control theory? You have the standard behavioral view from the outside, the environment's controlling you. And if we take a Skinnerian view, it's basically you're an operator engaging an operant, and then it's the flow of resources that pull you into the selection of behavior. And so we can then track the actual control through the environment. Okay. And then what you really thought about it, this has always annoyed me, is actually, you know, all the calories are actually coming from the effing organism. Okay. Yeah. Like the energy, work energy is not coming really from the environment. What the organism is doing is tracking forms and then pulling those forms and then investing. Right. And then how does it actually do that? Well, actually what it's trying to do is it's trying to create a particular perceptual set. Okay. Meaning that it's sort of like, and here's, I'll just give you a simple example. So let's say you want to fry an egg. Okay. The argument basically is, hey, where are you? Okay. What does a fried egg look like? What are the steps that afford you to move in that direction? And then how do you bring your perceptions online with those steps, essentially? And actually, folks to know in UTOK, the entire experiential system is organized by what I call the PME relation, which is basically perception, which is to organize the inputs into a schematic, M, which is what's your reference goal state in relationship to that, and E is energized motion that maintains that particular relation. So Power's perceptual control theory sits integrated into the whole UTOK structure pretty deeply, and it was revolutionary for me because I was trying to figure out this behavioral cognitive move, and perceptual control theory does a beautiful thing in relation.
Yeah, well, that's all very well said. I wrote a paper some years back defining the use of the concept control throughout American experimental psychology. And what I came to is that, by the way, I have no real beef with behaviorism practically.
Neither do I.
Philosophically, I find it just kind of bankrupt in the end. Because what Skinner was doing was using the notion of causality in an efficient cause sort of way.
Exactly.
Right? Two particles bouncing into each other and imparting force on each other. And scientifically, that's about the best we could do when he was doing his writing. So, you know, to ride that horse into philosophy is just something psychology does all the time. And I'm going to argue it doesn't do a good job of it. And even though I do have a signed letter from B.F. Skinner. As a naive undergraduate, I invited him to come give a talk at my university. And I think he wrote something like, "Dear Mr. Jordan, I'm so touched by your very kind invitation. Unfortunately, I find it so highly reinforcing to stay at my desk and finish my work that I'm going to have to decline." I mean, I have it in a frame. And so I love the man's tenacity. I love the way he pushed experimental psychology to reconsider itself. At the same time, the problem with Walden too is that no one shows up unless they want to. And so, yeah, I will say this is, to be honest, this is a great place to talk. There are things, and this, and Powers pointed this out actually with data. There are things that the behaviorists got exactly right. And that is, if I am a functioning control system, you should find a perfect correlation between my muscle movements and environmental perturbation.
Yep.
And those are the stimulus response laws discovered by the behaviorists.
Totally.
The problem is those laws only work in situations where you can control an organism's environment. And of course, that was Skinner's big thing. Control the environment, you'll control behavior. Okay, that's pretty despotic, right? I mean, that's not what we do to most human beings. There are some who are diagnosed in certain ways that we do control their environment to try to manage certain behaviors out of them. But it's just insufficient for the complexity of the human condition. So perceptual control theory was like you said, boom, explosions for me, because what it allowed, it gave the organism efficacy in ways that behaviorism had purposefully denied it, which is kind of ironic, right? I'm going to intentionally deny it.
I'm going to intentionally deny the intention. Recursively feed back into the loop.
Oh, Lord have mercy. Exactly. The thing is, when I wasn't working, when I left graduate school, I was left with relational thinking, and then this idea that organisms control their input, and anti-representationalist control of input. Yet Powers was a representationalist.
Yeah.
Right. Powers had no problem with servomechanistic accounts, and I have no problem with servomechanistic accounts. What we often get wrong, what we get backwards as psychologists, and again, this was pointed out by Powers, is that organisms were the model for engineers in World War II. they tried to create systems that could generate stable states in the environment by organizing themselves in certain ways, right? So they created whatever concepts they needed to create such a system. They called it input, output, reference signal, and such. And when we adopted the computer metaphor, we basically adopted that line of thinking, hook, line, and sinker. But we kept that behaviorist idea in there that what we're controlling is behavior, and then who's controlling it, the environment. And so one of the things we missed, and then this is something that I've pointed out in papers, in the 50s and the 40s, when we started realizing that we could actually pre-tune our experiences, instead of calling, you can hear your name at a cocktail party before, we could pre-tune our experiences. Instead of calling that pre-tuned perception or intentional perception, we called it attention. Right? So intention got thrown over to the motor output side of our servomechanistic loop, and attention got put over into the perceptual side. And this is something I've sort of been writing, I don't want to say against, but trying to reformulate for about 20 years. Because if we have followed Powers' thinking clearly, then what organisms do is control their experiences. Right. And so life is the control of experience. And this is just not a way we're used to talking. Right. So those words, that rhetoric, that's kind of what I had in mind. And so I kept working at ways to rectify this idea of controlling input, which was a fairly servomechanistic idea, with this ecological notion that perception is a relational property between organism and the environment. And what I had to do was find a way to come up with a relational control system. How's it going to work? And then I realized what I'm doing is just banging rhetorics against each other. And to the point where I created a bizarre, then I came across complex systems theory, right? I read Glegg's book. What's it? Farmer, Peckfield, Crutchfield, and Shaw, or whatever. I read all those papers. Started actually doing a little bit of data collecting reaction times, looking for chaotic attractors and trial-to-trial changes in reaction time. I did find some interesting stuff, never published it.
Interesting.
But you see massive changes in the orders of magnitude in reaction times with children diagnosed with ADHD when they're on medication versus when they're off. So, for example, even though their mean reaction time might come more into the normal range when they're on medication, the trial-to-trial variability is not complex. It's not complex like it would be in what we would call a non-diagnosed or healthy cognitive system. Interesting. So something's being dampened in these systems with the medication. It's keeping their behavior in a certain space, and what that's doing is decreasing I would argue, in a wild system like this, you have multiple scales of interacting dynamics that are allowed to constrain each other according to the magnitude of their scale. That's what, white, that's what pink noise is. That's what a healthy system is. And if you get something in one of these systems where at one level it's not able to cooperate with the others, for example, a clump in an artery or those sort of things, you see a decrease in the complexity of the time series. So, I mean, never published it, but I did it, and I'm like, okay, how do I do this with, input control systems that are relational? Developed this idea called self-organizing information pockets. Trying to look, and that just didn't work, right? And I, for myself, what ended up having to go was the concept of information.
Yeah, I saw that.
And the reason it had to go is because in the computational model, you get meaning for free because the bit has causal properties. That's why we use the word. And then we just say it is transferring information, right? Like in a computer. So the meaning just kind of lays on top of the causality. And then, very smart philosophers come by and tell us that this is philosophically bankrupt, that there's, you can have, it's logically possible to have a completely causal system with no information, no meaning, no phenomenology riding on the carrier wave. And I agree, right? So for me, someone who cares about the taste of ice cream, who cares about the experience of lived life, I had to find a way to talk about what we are that made the taste of ice cream, that made phenomenology, consciousness, necessary.
Right.
It couldn't just be, well, the causality, the physical is first, and then we got to squeeze this into it. And what I started doing was actually attacking the notion of the distinction between objective and subjective properties.
Right.
And probably in about 2015, I had a bit of a breakthrough that spanned like 100 years of different scholars. So again, tell me to stop whenever you want.
No. Well, I mean, this is okay. So there are a lot of possible things for us to come back to. Okay. Because the way in which you're construing these relations, the way in which John construes these relations, John Vervaeke, the way in which I construed these relations, we're really traveling up very similar mountains, but we're grabbing a hold of different kinds of elements. So, behavioral investment theory emerges for me essentially to manage very similar dynamics that you're talking about here.
Yes.
So we'll come back to that. And that then lines up with John's recursive relevance realization. And I'm sensing very strongly it's lining up with what's becoming wild systems. So I'm listening to this being, oh, okay, that's how that's how you climb that little mountain and you dealt with that and you're moving along there. So I'm just enjoying that. It's maybe a little abstract for some folks if you know the background, but I want to get into this in terms of, so that's my little asterisk as I'm enjoying the.
Well, the thing is, but there's an incredible amount of joy that comes to academic life when you come across kindred spirits who have arrived at a very similar location from very different very different starting points, right?
Gives life meaning.
And you can see the rhetorical maneuvers we have made to make our way up this space.
Totally.
And I honestly am very optimistic. I do think the 21st century is a century of holism. And I do think these kind of efforts are what are pushing not just psychology, but scholarship in general, because psychology's reliance on physical mental dialectics or subjective objective dichotomies, that comes from imitating classical physics.
Totally.
Right? And even though, we had in the mid to late 1800s, there were fantastic field-oriented psychologists in Germany and the continent.
Helmholtz. Somebody get me Helmholtz on the line.
Exactly. Who were trying to say relational type things and actually talk more in terms of field theory, which is a relational concept.
Okay, so I interrupted you. So you're at 2015. You're spanning 100 years of.
Yeah. So in the mid 1800s in Europe, there was a massive struggle going on. It had been going on for centuries between science, or what we call natural science or natural philosophy, and religion. And Galileo got grounded for the rest of his life in his bedroom because he wrote a letter to the Pope saying that natural philosophers should have authority over the material realm and the church should have authority over the spiritual realm, and the church refused to give up its power. So there really is power at stake in terms of who has the say on what's true in our rhetoric about reality. And so at the time that natural philosophy was moving along the lines of John Locke and the idea of a physical world that gives rise to subjective impressions, and you have David Hume come along, and this is important, who reveals the logical incoherence of such correspondence ways of thinking about how we relate to something outside of ourselves. I think we can see a huge bifurcation in Western philosophy at that point. You see, usually it's said, people say it starts with Kant, who said, Hume woke him up from his dogmatic slumbers. He starts moving in a way that almost gets there, but still gets stuck with something like a noumena, right? And then you see other people moving to Hegel, and then my favorite philosopher, a guy named Michael Oakeshott. I think you mentioned him on John's program. I don't know. No, the dude blew my mind, man. I found a book about him in 2001 at one of the Tucson conferences. It's called The Skeptical Idealist. And what Oakeshott did was take and I hate the word idealist, I'm going to call them coherence philosophers, because calling them idealist philosophers is not a name they came up with.
Right.
So other people labeled them that, and it's a very unfortunate name. I'm going to call them coherence philosophers, and what I mean by this is that they refuse to start a conversation about reality in terms of how it differs from experience. So they were refusing to define reality in a dialectical relationship with experience, which is exactly what Locke does, which is exactly what contemporary information processing theory does, right? There's an epistemic gap between organism and environment, and I have to find a way to cross it, so I use my sensory systems and my brain. And that is simply a logically coherent assertion. What that means is, if I claim that I know something to be outside of me because of the impressions it causes within me, all I have access to are those internal impressions. And no matter what I can do, I can never escape them. People say, well, can't you kick a rock? Well, yeah, right. But all you're doing is knowing the rock through internal representation. So it's logically incoherent. You can't know what's outside of you that way. So guys like Kant, Hegel, and then in the Upanishad tried to create ways of talking about reality that didn't define it dialectically against experience. And they talked in ways that scientists couldn't stand. They just couldn't stand. Plus, the epistemic gap of objective and subjective properties provided science a way to have the same kind of authority over culture that the church did.
Right.
And that is, okay, I'm not an internal soul, I'm just an internal mind. And I still know what's outside of me by this correspondence relation that Descartes made famous, and others as well.
So let me pause you here, because so just for people that know UTOK, know that I situate UTOK in relation to what I call the Enlightenment Gap. Okay? So the Enlightenment Gap is, as modern natural empirical science emerges, sometimes I arrange that as men's knowledge, and I play off of that as wisdom-oriented knowledge we need for women's knowledge. But anyway, modern empirical natural science emerges with its third-person objectivist epistemic structure, splits a third-person quantitative behavioral structure from a first-person qualitative structure. And as a function of that and its ontology, it essentially breaks our coherent capacity to put matter in relationship to mind. Okay, so we get a mind-body problem. And we also get confusion about how to specify what is scientific knowledge relative to subjective and socially constructed knowledge, which then comes back to a postmodern critique on modernity. So you see a mind-body problem and a modernist, postmodernist problem emerging out of the gap of understanding that, an incoherent gap of understanding that you are basically delineating with a lot of specificity here.
Well, I think you just dropped the mic on that issue, right? Because it's exactly the case. It's all a symptom of a rhetoric. It's not an ontological problem. And not only that, as people continue to buy into the subject of objective divide, and they put things like the self or things like conscious will on one axis of that divide, and then they start looking at what exists there scientifically, and they see brains, and they can't find a self, they can't find conscious will. They actually believe that means that those things don't exist. And the problem with that is it's just philosophically sophomoric. I mean, they don't understand that they're creating category mistakes, trying to bring two rhetorics together as if one is ontologically transparent and one is subjectively mishmashed.
Totally.
And this has gotten to the point where it's dangerous, right? Because the minute we can distinguish between a reality of suffering and a reality of non-suffering, for religion, the reality of at least Western Christianity, the realm of non-suffering is not this one. It's an eternal place outside of contingency, right? But now we're talking about trapping ourselves in bits and escape, kind of escaping contingency that way. And it's kind of like this promissory note that realism took out, right? Realism, the idea that that which is real is that which is not experience, right? I mean, we know, that promissory note, nothing supports it. Every scientific finding, particularly quantum physics, right? All of this stuff just completely deconstructs the idea of an epistemic gap. And then we're not forced to look at reality differently, because there's no selective pressure on experimental psychologists to have a coherent philosophy, right?
Actually, I'm going to asterisk that there is an epistemic process to be incoherent, quite frankly. Okay, so I'm going to pause on this because this is part of my beef. All right, so correct me if I'm wrong, but basically this is my point. One of the points about UTOK, as out from the Enlightenment Gap, springs ultimately what I call the problem of psychology. Okay. Yeah. So the problem of psychology gets identified very nicely by Vygotsky in 1927 as the crisis. And he lays it out. It's like, guys, all these schools of thought, they're talking about completely different subject matters. And even a layperson can tell you that. So you don't know what you mean by psychology. So then psychologists said, well, gosh, that's true. What we'll do is we'll adopt the methods of behavioral science. Yeah. And then we'll call ourselves scientists, not because we have a coherent ideology, but because we commit to the behavioral science methodology, which, by the way, grounds you in an epistemology that forces a subject-object split, just like you said, as we try to understand what the hell the psyche is, which, by the way, includes subjective experience. And now we're going to basically say, well, you cannot solve this problem. You cannot have a coherent psychology. Read any book. Well, some people want to, but you really can't. Best you can do is apply the methods of science. Yeah. Ergo, all these theorists out there who, the four of us that are actually talking big picture stuff, don't worry about them. Go out there, develop a research paradigm, and contribute your slice of knowledge through the methods of science to this thing we call mind. All right. So there's my bitch. And it's like, listen, folks, we invert this thing, you can get a coherent science. Actually, coherent ontological knowledge is really something science wants.
Yeah.
So there's my little rant on the problem of psychology.
No, that's okay. I mean, I've in order to bring wild systems to the fore and actually get it published, examine what I can do with it and publish it, teach it to students, talk about it at conferences. I just carry myself as if my worldview is a personal opinion. Now, while I'm talking to myself, I know that I'm maximally coherent compared to the other stuff that's out there. But since maximum coherence is not a truth constraint in correspondence, I don't qualify for consideration. Here's the thing, though.
All right, hold on. I got to pause again. I'm sorry to keep interrupting.
I mean, in those circles is what I meant, man.
Yeah, let's help folks understand. Okay, so there are different epistemologies, frameworks for knowing, like foundationalism. René Descartes tries foundationalism. Science emerges primarily as a correspondent theory of truth. It builds representational models that experimentally test them and then reference those against that. There are also coherentist approaches to truth. A coherentist approach looks at the internal validity and then maximizes the correspondence at the gestalt level and looks for holistic, comprehensive elements. So the unified is a pull off of E.O. Wilson's Consilience, where he is hunting for a naturalistic approach. Now, I think he fails because he actually doesn't get mind right and doesn't solve the Enlightenment Gap, and he doesn't solve the problem of psychology. UTOK comes in, tweaks E.O. Wilson, bridges it to wisdom traditions, and then says, hey, we actually can achieve a consilient, coherent, big picture view of knowledge that interrelates properly construed subjective, objective, and intersubjective epistemological frames.
And it'll never be done.
So
there'll never be an answer.
So
right, there will just be the coherence we're capable of generating at that time and in that context. And the problem with that view is it doesn't buy you power. Right. And that was really what was at stake for Bertrand Russell in the turn of the 20th century was, we can't have this German highfalutin philosophy that no one's going to understand and care about. That we can't have that be for science. Science has to be mathematics. Science has to be set theory.
Right.
And so 1911 paper by Bertrand Russell, he does a lot to deconstruct, he deconstructs the notion of internal relations, right? So the idea of internal relations is that you have phenomenon A and you have phenomenon B. The idea of internal relations is that the relations between A and B are actually constituent of what A and B are. So the reason that what I would call coherence philosophers, others would call idealist philosophers, the reason they started to talk this way is because the correspondence model rips the object and the subject apart.
Exactly.
And so how do we talk about the fact that I'm sitting here, I'm having a world of experience right now where I say words like, I am seeing my computer. So my language entails what looks like an obvious commitment to correspondence because I'm making declarations about this and I'm making declarations about that. Now, see, the folks, they didn't give jack about correspondence versus when they developed the language, I'm looking at my computer, right? It's us who take that language and then try to go hyper analytic on it, and that's what we do, and that's fine.
It's a chronic condition.
Well, yes, and it took me a long time as a blue collar kid to understand or at least generate a narrative of the value of my way of being, right? And as I look around the world, it's clear that the world doesn't need a whole bunch of us, right? Because if everybody were doing what we do, things wouldn't get done, right? So it looks to me like the evolution of culture has sort of selected the emergence of groups that predominantly where most members manipulate context directly, and then a small group of members do the kind of stuff we do. I'm not at all trying to be elitist here. I mean, Plato was straight up elitist about it, right? With the philosopher king. But, someone had to figure out how to get that fire from one camp to the next. And it's, someone had to drink that green water first and, all these things. So it took me a while to recognize that's my role.
Right.
And then when I was able to start to develop wild systems, and I'll explain a little fully as we go through, as I was able to get it to the point where I could describe a fully relational ontology that allowed me to transcend subjective-objective divides and tell my students, you are embodiments of context, you are meaning. The issue in your life is not to find it, but to manage it. They suddenly felt seen, right? They suddenly heard psychology talking to them in a way that was coherent with lived life.
Right.
And that was always the gig. How do I talk about reality in ways
let's pause on that. I really like that. I think you heard you say that to John maybe, but I heard it, I want to sink it in again. Okay, it's not about finding meaning.
Right.
It's about managing.
Managing, because we are meaning.
Because meaning is essentially a given. Meaning is
if we think of ourselves, for example, if we look at the structural dynamics of a lion, right? We can look at the visuals. We can look at it as a lion as a multi-scale embodiment of the constraints that have to be addressed to capture a zebra. So the muscles, the brain, the entire architecture, the way the visual system works, right, is every level of it is a representation to reality of that system's phylogenetic history. Right. So therefore, there's no point in which there's any epistemic gap. There's no point in which there's something in that system that is not about. Right. So if the system is, for me, I can say it's a physical system. I prefer to say it is an embodiment of context. And by using that word context, I don't make any divides because what's outside of the system but context, the most ontologically neutral term I can come up with. And then if I call us embodiments of context and it makes sense to people, that means that we're embodied aboutness. And therefore we are meaning. There is nothing about us that is not meaning. And so therefore we don't find meaning, we manage it. And the reason this is important to me, because this completely changes the argument on morality, completely changes the argument on values in a direction that's actually maximally coherent with the founding principles of democracy. Democracy never had anything to do with doing sort of any sort of abstract right or wrong. It basically legally afforded me the opportunity to try to persuade others to want the same thing I do. And I have huge respect for the emergence of that way of organizing people into the world. Now, of course, it was based on racist principles and land stolen from others, and we the idea of a perfect union bugs the crap out of me. We're just going to work to make our world maximally coherent. So if we admit that someone's a human being, all of the constraints on how we behave with human beings is given to all. I think that's the best we can do. And from that space, I think emerges mutual self-respect, which has nothing to do with right and wrong. So anyway.
Interesting. Yeah, no, that'd be a interesting foray into axiology and where that's taken you. But let's blend ourselves toward wild systems theory so we can give folks a framing. I mean, that's where we're headed. So let's make sure we're maintain that, because that's a major feature.
Well, this all takes, it all started with the Bertrand Russell thing, right?
Right.
Bertrand Russell has to challenge this idealist notion of internal relations, because they were arguing that objects emerge within subjects. So that there is no epistemic gap. That didn't seem to grant science the authority it needed. So Bertrand Russell made a strong case for what would be called external relations. His famous example is Sam and Mary and their relative height. So Sam is taller than Mary. And what Bertrand Russell argued is that difference in their height is a relation between them that is in no way constitutive of the two of them. So the fact that Mary's shorter than Sam has nothing to do with who Mary is, and the fact that Sam's taller has nothing to do with who he is. So therefore, that relationship is external to them. And you can only Bertrand Russell worked hard to the point where it took over American philosophy in the 20th century, right? And external relations became everything, to the point where the early 21st century, nobody's talking about internal relations. The only people that were close were the ecological people, talking about one level of existence, perception, as being relational, which I would argue would be an internal relation. So Bertrand worked really hard, and by using external relations as a dominant way of looking at reality, mathematics and set theory become the dominant tools of truth. And since you've opted into a correspondence model, the truth that the math and the set theory is giving you is the best. It corresponds to reality better than anything else, right? And so that's early 20th century. Now, early 21st century, I'm reading papers and where philosophers of science are critiquing the notion of intrinsic properties. Right. So the archetypal intrinsic property is mass, right? And it's often contrasted dialectically to weight. So, mass is intrinsic because it belongs to the system itself. It doesn't come to be because of what it's in. Whereas weight is a measurement of a mass in a gravity field. So it's relational. And so this intrinsic versus relational thing is kind of a 21st century equivalent of external versus internal relations.
I haven't made that relation.
So we had swung all the way to the external relations world, which left us with intrinsic things that were externally related. And then, but a bunch of people started criticizing the notion of intrinsic properties, particularly because of the Higgs field, right? Because it turns out that a particle acquires its inertial mass by moving through the Higgs field. Well, what is the Higgs field? Well, it's a field that permeates all of reality, right? So what's this mean? That means that mass is not intrinsic to the particle. Mass is a relational property. And since the mass is coming to the particle through something that exists everywhere, this leads you to the idea that all properties are grounded globally. All properties are grounded relationally. And so connecting Bertrand Russell's move towards external relations with a contemporary move away from intrinsic properties really allowed me to say, okay, I'm talking right to the physicists now, right?
Right, right.
That's how I start to make a case for relational ontology, which is just a recapitulation of coherence thinking and idealism, but in a 21st century framework. So,
That is so cool.
oh, well, thanks, man.
Yeah, no, I mean, it really is. I mean, the lines of thought that you're trailing, I'm following these different lines of thought, but coming to enormously similar conclusions. I mean, the system that I built emerges basically in this sort of field structure for quantum mechanics that becomes relational quantum mechanics.
Yeah.
And basically Timothy Eastman recently offered a book based on Whitehead stuff that afforded a particular view.
Yes.
It's essentially a relational quantum field theory. It's like, yeah, no, that's where I'm headed. So listening to, and basically I'm using the term sort of field initially as sort of the largest kind of structure. And then the field is the ultimate context in which entity properties are constituted by, and therefore you have to have this sort of metaphysics of field, of relation and entity in totality. So listening to you, I'm like, oh yeah, no, that's pretty much where I was headed. And the coherence emphasis in relation as being forfeited or undermined and then needing to kind of come back. So those are all some really cool features. So I'm loving that.
Well, there's a lot of cultural implications of committing yourself to correspondence way of thinking or intrinsic properties. You combine that with the belief that contingency resides in a spatial temporal material realm, and there's some realm of salvation that's non-contingent, and you afford the emergence of all kinds of sociopathy, right? You get the emergence of a hyper-individualism where systems can believe, oh, I'm intrinsic, dude. This is me. I did this all myself. You stand on a road in the middle of a town and say, see, I got wealthy myself. And, I call it the Marlboro Man syndrome, right?
Okay.
Yes, the Marlboro Man. Dude, how do you know you're such a rugged individual? And with no irony at all, he says, what? I know I'm such a rugged individual because everybody tells me that I am. and doesn't get the irony. And that brutal irony is just permeating our culture in ways that are actually deselecting us right now to some extent. So these are not just harmless
deselecting. You want to give us a little, that's an interesting turn on phrase, deselecting. Do you want to share what you are referring to there?
The individualistic, I would argue, sociopathic form of individualism that has come to dominate the American economy and therefore the American culture is not going to sustain itself. It is giving rise to conditions that are no longer going to afford its sustainment.
Right. Okay.
The amount of wealth that has been, I won't use the word stolen because then I would get involved in a legal argument and then I would lose because people would say we didn't steal it. We just developed mechanisms on Wall Street that allowed us to harvest all this energy from other people. It was never illegal. In the name of this individualism, we have been able to pass laws that allow the individual to harvest incredible amounts of wealth and resources. And a lot of the things we're seeing in the past 5 years are showing us that way of existing is being challenged demographically in the next 30, 40 years.
Yep.
And generationally, I'm optimistic that as younger people become increasingly able to vote, we will see the dynamics of American democracy move more into a more holistic space. So deselect means a system is doing things that create aspects of context that actually no longer afford it the ability to exist.
Yeah, that's helpful to keep. So people are tracking that. Absolutely.
Yeah, I got you. So, all that struggle with relational thinking then kind of got converted into wild systems theory when I combined that commitment to relationality with dynamical systems theory and followed the lead of guys like Schrodinger, Varela, a guy named Larry Vandervert, Stuart Kaufman, who started looking at life as an entropy energy dynamic. And then once I combined that with the relational thinking, I was able to look at All right, what we are is embodiments of context, self-sustaining, multi-scale embodiments of context. Self-sustaining means, as Stuart Kaufman pointed out, that when chemical A and B interact, if they produce a product AB, that's actually a catalyst for the AB reaction. And the AB reaction is self-sustaining.
Okay.
As long as there's enough A's and B's available in the context, that system of work. And we know what the reaction means. Certain energies are released, right? So certain entropy is created.
Yep.
So taking that and then applying that all the way up the hierarchy of living systems, including ourselves, from our single neuron to the neural network, to the brain as a whole, to the body and its organs, to the organism in its context, to the creation of culture. All of this is self-sustaining work, meaning at every level, it's an entropy system.
Yeah.
And then what this does is move us away from notions of a glorious non-contingent realm, more towards something Eastern, where we are creators and destroyers simultaneously, right? There's no realm of eternal forgiveness or non-contingency. Rather, the best we do is what we do here. And then virtue, value, meaning, all of that is here, and we have to suss it out. And,
that seems to flow pretty naturally into like Wu Wei and other Tao Te Ching kinds of notions as well. Is that what you are referring
Absolutely.
to?
Yeah, I think we got kindred spirits from centuries ago, right? I mean, there are people that came, I would call these coherence frameworks, right? These are systems, these are thinkers, systems of rhetoric, systems of being that recognize the destructive, the inherently destructive nature of being. And it's consistent with what you'll find in indigenous ontologies, right? And where you look at the world you live in as a Gaia, as a sort of living system, right? And then for me, the big value is you never get to look at yourself clean. You never get to look at yourself as the world's fine. I don't do anything that causes the world any harm. Every time even if you eat a bowl of vegetable soup, you just killed you deconstructed a bunch of systems we call plants. And then we have stupid arguments like, well, plants can't feel, which by the way is not true. Plants don't. So we're going to say that I'm not going to eat those things because they can feel. But I'm not going to eat those because they can't. And we get stuck with that because we're in these objective, subjective. We refuse to accept our role as destroyers and generators of suffering. And so we try to create rhetorics for ourselves that deny that we're creators of suffering. We're virtuous, we're good. I'll stop there. I think it's pretty.
Yeah, no, there's there are two different directions. One thing we could dialogue about, I'd be definitely interested in, I would say, and see if you say, there are ways in which animals feel that plants probably don't feel.
Agreed.
Okay. So we'll qualify that, but I'm more interested, and that might be an interesting conversation.
No, that'd be great. Yeah.
I'm more interested in, I'm interested in both. We can go back to that. Like, where you said you're optimistic, how does the current system evolve? So let's start with the knowledge system rather than society in general, the academy. How are we, those of us that are like, perhaps not to sound elitist, but if there's a particular seeing vision around a need to return to coherence, a need to evolve from the current reductive, science, first Enlightenment science kind of notion, it feels to me like I'm connecting with a lot of people that are sort of on the edge of this thing and are seeing it. And there's an enormous amount of convergence, which is really exciting. I mean, John and I now have done 4 different series together on connecting our systems up. And it's like, oh yeah, no, your recursive relevance realization and my UTOK psychology is like, oh my God, there's a lock and key function here. And then I'm listening to other people. And it's like, yeah, no, there's a lot of locks and a lot of keys and a lot of opportunity. What are you seeing in terms of, so I'm seeing this, but it's also on the fringe. There's an enormous amount of institutional inertia. Are you optimistic about a phase transition into different thinking? How do you see that happening? Where are you in that Are you wandering out in the desert alone? I sometimes feel that. So
no, that's a really good question, and it matters in terms of how I've organized my life the past 5-7 years or whatever. Culture never gave up on meaning, right? And culture's been writing novels, comic books, making movies forever.
Yep.
Science and philosophy, we're the ones that have painted ourselves into a corner that has become, I'm sorry, but when we say there's no such thing as the self, and we say that free will or conscious will is an illusion, we're painting ourselves into a corner of irrelevance. And we're losing our ability to talk to culture in meaningful ways. So then we write all these analytic things about how they should behave and what they shouldn't eat. And, fine. We act as though the point is to not suffer, right? And I'm not saying we should suffer. What I'm trying to get at is because of our commitment to a correspondence frame, which challenges the reality of lived experience, we've made ourselves kind of conceptually irrelevant. And so what I've been doing for 5-7 years or more, I've been going to Comic-Cons and doing panels. Right?
Really?
So
Tell me about that. Yeah, no, that sounds that actually, I wasn't aware of that history. That's an interesting turn in this conversation.
Oh, I love this stuff.
Okay.
So I went to WonderCon in California a couple months ago and did some panels. One was Zombies, Blips, and the Apocalypse, Why Write About Disruptions?
Okay.
And what I did was I invited 5 scholars, creators to tell 5-minute versions of their favorite disruptive tale. And then talk to the audience about why those get written. And the complexity here, when I organize one of these panels, what I do is I tell every panelist, you're going to get about 3 to 4 minutes of uninterrupted time to tell your perspective. Okay. So be prepared, and then we'll riff on that as a group, and then we'll move down the row, and then, with the last 20 minutes or so, we'll talk to the audience. What I have found is by getting these experts, these different forms of expertise together, talking about the human condition, using the medium of pop culture as the interface, we're able to create these conversational spaces that don't get created often in classrooms because we're talking about analytic stuff in textbooks and we're labeling everything and we're not forefronting lived life. All of these stories forefront lived life and what's at stake. And the audience, because we do that difficult, nuanced work for the first half hour, the audience ends up asking questions they would have never gotten to the point of asking because of a context we've created. So
that's so cool. I just sort of randomly, one of the things I do, here's an example, which actually is somewhat parallel. So I teach in personality class.
Yeah.
Okay? So I just showed a clip of Seinfeld of George and Jerry. And it's actually a little clips on the switch. And Jerry wants to date one roommate and switch over. And there's this sort of iconic scene, if you like Seinfeld and this and all this stuff. And I have them watch the show. And I was like, well, tell me about their personalities. Okay. And then the students go around and they're almost always sort of like, well, I think, George is kind of neurotic. So they give me the big 5,
Yes.
And so they're trying to extract patterns. And then, it's like, and then I'm like, is that what personality is, really? Okay. And then from a UTOK perspective, so what you want to do is you want to get the ontology of human behavior. You don't want to break this up into behavior and mental processes that you then model.
Right.
You want to say, what do you see?
Right.
Okay. Humans actually doing. And then it contextualizes what we're doing as investing creatures that are influencing each other and justifying what we're doing.
Yes.
Okay? And it says, if you understand personality, you understand the general framing and then the idiosyncratic differences across maybe big 5. We can talk about why you might use some of those languages, but you don't try to just extract big 5 essentialist categories and then utilize that to describe before you contextualize what's actually happening in lived experience. And so that's the message. And I just because we were talking about it yesterday. I was like, I'll throw up a blog on that. Anyway, cool. It was just sort of like, hey, observe human mental behavior in lived life and then see what see how you understand it. So that's essentially what I'm hearing as at least a an organizing frame of reference, and that's got me really excited. That's fascinating to bring experts.
No, it's kind of my modus operandi right now. It's a way for me to manifest wild systems theory in the daily lives of people who came to talk about and celebrate pop culture. And I'll be honest with you, if you look at some of the narratives in popular culture the last 10 years, last 20 years, they're better than most psychological theories because they just show you, right? So
right, I begin some of my psychology. If you really want to understand humans, you probably should first go to read Shakespeare rather than listen to me.
Yes. Yes,
so,
life is more poetry than more poetry than analysis, right? And
okay. So is there then? Is that giving traction? I mean, people going around going like, "Oh my gosh, wild systems theory." I mean, not that I would have heard of it, but it's sort of like,
right.
So do you feel that or
so I'm going to say no in the sense that I don't go to a Comic-Con and introduce myself as
that's a wild systems
guy. I actually
you need a character.
Well, I introduced myself as Sir Zombie Scotty.
Okay, well there you go.
That has to do with the fact that early in my life I loved pop culture. I loved TV. I loved movies. I played Dungeons and Dragons, and all these highly imaginative, creative spaces that I got to be in with other people. And then when I got to college and hadn't really been a good student as a high schooler, I really had to intentionally reorganize how I was doing things so I could do well in academia. And that meant that I spent time doing more of that than those other things. And that just tended, I still watch Stranger Things all by myself. I still watched, all the great sci-fi by myself, Ghost in the Shell, all that stuff. But it was by myself, right? Because I had other things to do during the workday. And then about 7 years ago, I went to WizardCon in Chicago with a friend, Dr. Eric Wesselman, and we came across this desk. A guy named Dr. Travis Langley. Dr. Travis Langley was advertising a book he'd written on Batman psychology. Okay. And so we looked at it, we talked to him, and he said, "We're doing a panel on The Walking Dead if you want to watch that." So I went to the panel on The Walking Dead, and what are they doing? They're talking about trauma, right? And they're bringing psychology to pop culture, which, by the way, had taken the time to write good stories and present.
Right.
Pop culture had gotten to the level where it was what I like to call, discipline relevant, right? It was complex and nuanced enough that we could actually lean into it as vignettes and examples. And we saw that panel. We said, "Damn, this is pretty authentic." And we went back to his table and said, "How do we participate?" Well, he was doing a book on Star Trek, so we wrote a book chapter on Star Trek psychology. And since then, I've probably written 10 of these chapters for about 6 or 7 different books. Wow. And it's really become a powerful, I don't have to call it wild systems theory. I can just be wild systems theory. And then if someone wants to go to a bar or something and talk more about this stuff, I don't know how long what it take before I sort of whipped out the label wild systems theory. That label is almost more important for academics because I have to place wild systems theory within the world of information processing theory, complex systems theory. But it's taken up more and more of my identity. It's extremely generative to the point where about 2 years ago, fall of 20, I started this monthly Zoom Comic-Con panel thing called ReggieCon.
Really?
Our mascot is a red bird, and his name is Reggie. Okay. So what we do is we get on Zoom for an hour and a half, and we celebrate whatever History Heritage Month is culturally celebrated at that time. So LGBTQ History Month, Black History Month, whatever. We find a comic book, a graphic novel, a movie, something that is well known. We sort of assign that as a viewing or a reading, and then I get a bunch of scholars who know something about that content area, and we get together. We have complex, nuanced, post-dinner adult conversations that are highly intersectional, extremely give and take, a lot of fun, a lot of intensity, and what we're trying to model is how to be in these highly intersectional spaces.
Wow.
One thing that our culture lacks right now is how do we be intersectional together?
Yep.
How do we, and the problem that we're facing is that Facebook and YouTube, which I'm on and I use, so I'm not trying to be a Facebook, Twitter hater. The thing is, and YouTube as well, when these snippets of information dominate the way we think, we lack our ability to engage in nuance. So it has to be modeled. People have to see that we can disagree about the meaning of Black Panther and go back and forth on it. And this is all slow burn stuff, right? And one of the things that I think we need to start training people who are interested in change, including us, right? Is we haven't had a conversation about what constitutes success for our efforts. And because of that, and because we've been indoctrinated into an individualist culture, we translate activist success with the persuasion of individual minds. And that's a surefire way to burn out and become cynical. So I try to teach students in particular is that the job of an activist is to be a persistent voice of a value in culture. That's your job. Like these videos that you're making, that's the job, right? Get this stuff in the world of ideas so that it's not that not everybody's going to come say, whoa, man, wild system, sign me up, dude. They know it's there. And if they ever are in a space in their lives where they might remember that and it's a place they can go, that's how real change happens culturally anyway. It's not like everybody gets persuaded and does what someone says in most cases. So it's slow burn work, and it's very much wild systems, right? Change the context you live in if you want to live in a different context. So
that's glorious.
Well, I got to talk about that. That's so cool. Thank you.
No, that's absolutely. Well, I mean, this has certainly been my own. I fall deep into a rabbit hole analytically, and then my journey was very similar to yours. Only I stayed with the clinician. I mean, I worked with suicide attempters for a long time, and and lived in that. But there's always this bridge between there's this huge analytic thing. There's first is the joy of trying to discover stuff, putting puzzle pieces together, finding like-minded scholars, and realizing meanings was there all along.
Exactly. Exactly.
And then there's also this whole, wait a minute, how do I apply? And then quite frankly, how do I apply it? Like with a degree I have right now, I have this weird sense of, wow, there's a bit of urgency and actually also alienation and opportunity. There's this weird, flux dynamic, phase shift flux dynamics. What is the right way to position myself? When is it, there's slow burn. I mean, I use the metaphor of the garden all the time. I want to create my local garden, imagine that fractally across a wide variety of different domains, oscillate between what my attention is across that fractal, and depending on, mood and events of the day and the own shit that's happening in my life and what I'm producing, in terms of entropy. But all of that's the way I've kind of tried to navigate at least what feels at times confusing, and at least in terms of like, wow, there's a lot of variables and how to kind of be in a particular way that, is true to myself and feels like in terms of the long arc of history, well aligned. But anyway, those are just some.
One of my good friends, Dr. Harold Ottmansbacher, when I was perhaps engaging in a bit of self-pity about the lack of success of wild systems, he said, hey man, only dead fish swim with the current. And the things that, you mentioned Shakespeare earlier. My favorite line is to be or not to be, suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. What I try to tell students is, man, those slings and arrows are a lot easier to bear if you're moving forward with an idea. But if you don't have something to push into the world, and then you find yourself Twittered and Facebook to death. So for me, it's about, first of all, I don't treat individuals as average cases of humanness.
Nice.
I appreciate and love diversity. And what that means is, so does natural selection, right? evolution, I'm going to argue, I might get in trouble, doesn't tend to really select individual organisms. It selects species, right? And how they collectively organize contexts in ways that enhance their sustainment. Well, the maximally coherent way to do that is to have as much tolerable difference in the group as possible, to be able to handle any degrees of freedom that come your way.
Nice.
And this is a strength. This is not something. It's not a weakness at all. And trying to bring that idea, that way of thinking, into my students' life, into my colleagues' life, into my family's life. It feels like mission. And once I came to the conclusion, and I didn't come to this conclusion myself, thinking to myself, I came to this conclusion when I was asked by a young high school student, what do I do if I can't persuade anyone? And my answer to him was, that's not your job. Your job is to be a persistent presence in culture. Okay, that's my job, to be a persistent presence in culture for all those young people, and maybe not so young people, who've lived a life of wonder and maybe felt alone throughout most of it, right? When my 18, 20-something, 25-something students see me talking about Fullmetal Alchemist and Avatar: The Last Airbender, and they lose their mind. What they don't understand is those are just good stories that were told in their time. Right. Shakespeare were great. Those were great stories told in his time. And, they think, why would an old guy be watching cartoons? Well, no, I'm watching a fantastic story, and a story that's inherently holist, that I actually, would use in a class to show them what it's like to live holistically. So.
That's beautiful.
No, thanks.
Yeah, no, that's really nourishing. And I think grounding is the same,
Yes. And it's easy for me because I love cartoons.
Right. I'm not saying go ahead. Everyone's got cartoons.
I've always loved cell animation, man. I mean, when I watched Princess Mononoke in '99, it was about a year after it came out. I watched that thing 3 times in 2 days. I've probably watched it 30 times since then. It's, for me, the best damn story ever told. And it's animated with cell animation, and it's all about the curse of being, which is we are entropy systems, and the best we can do is cultivate self-respect in others. And by doing that, we cultivate self-respect in ourselves. I mean, so it's not about being right or wrong. It's a different space. Yeah.
Right. Well, again, I'll just make a little link to UTOK, and then maybe we can start to see if there's anything else that we didn't cover that you hope to get to, and then see where this leaves us. So one of the things in the system is it tracks our what's called the human relationship system. Okay. And this is basically the way we're mapping the self-other space. And what it says is that we're tracking at its sort of fundamental contextualizing, organizing variable is what's called social influence and relational value. RVSI line. Social influence is the instrumental capacity to move people around. Relational value is the felt sense of being known, seen, known, and valued by important others.
Yes.
And fundamentally, it argues that actually our economic system and much of our modern system splits and then grossly overvalues social influence.
Yeah.
And undermines the actual grounding, which is the felt sense of seen, known, and valued relational value.
Yeah.
And it really argues that if we're going to find a core variable that to network ourselves together and in proper relation, it's maximizing the felt sense of relational value across the network. So when I hear you say, hey, respect other, respect self, well, value other, value self in a particular kind of way, in a core foundational way, that lines with very much with the psychic architecture as I map it in relationship to our relational world.
What's so satisfying to hear you say all that is I've never put that series of words together that way. And yet we're talking about the same phenomenon, right? And that's because you've climbed a different rhetorical mountain than I have. And nonetheless, we're still trying to bring words to a space so that we can share it with other people in ways that we hope will, produce change. And not only is it the best we can do, there's truly is joy in living that way. So hearing this foundational connection that you mentioned, my most recent paper, which isn't published yet, I talked about the foundational othering of living systems. And because I'm a wild systems theorist, that means I look at organisms as self-organizing energy transformation systems.
Yep.
That lets me look at the cell wall of a single cell as emergent from the work of the single cell. And what that means is that the work of the cell necessarily defines the other. What comes in, what doesn't. So being a living system is engaging in foundational othering, right? And it's this foundational othering that our brains do that allows us to separate experiences due to me versus experiences due to the world. And, we have schizophrenia as one of those diagnosable situations where individuals who are diagnosed, for example, find it easier to tickle themselves than non-diagnosed. And that's because they're not tracking their memory planning relationships the way non-diagnosed people do. So they experience this as coming from an other.
Yeah,
right.
That's a fascinating finding. I always thought it was cool.
It's amazing, and it's also a similar explanation of why they're vulnerable to hallucinations and delusions. They're generating these phenomena themselves, but they don't experience themselves. They don't track it with memories and planning like non-diagnosed people do. So they experience it as being from the other. So the fact that I'm sitting here and I can say a phrase like "I'm looking at my computer" reveals the othering that I necessarily do to be an entity that I can label as I. Now, all that matters because in our phenomenology, in our felt experience, we don't experience the actual work generating the othering. And this is why people have said the external world is a given, right? Because we don't feel our brains generating the other, we just feel other.
Yes.
And for me, correspondence philosophy is a commitment to taking phenomenology as it's experienced, accepting the othering, and not holding ourselves accountable for its generation.
Okay.
And these are the kind of subject-object divides that the idealists were trying to overcome. They didn't know what we know about brain dynamics and self-sustaining systems now, that othering is a necessary condition of being. And then we move into, human relationships and managing how we other, right? And we necessarily do other. You're you, I'm me. I don't feel my brain generating those distinctions, yet I'd argue my brain is generating those distinctions. And so I can choose to deny that I have anything to do with the sense of you and I, or I can say, the reason I'm experiencing a difference has everything to do with me. And therefore, then I become undeniably forever responsible for everything associated with my othering. Right? I don't get to say, yeah, that person deserved to be in prison because they're bad. Right? I don't get to say non-relational type things. Well, you can say it, but then you're just incoherent, right? And I think this leads to ways of being with others that recognizes our contribution to their otherness. Their otherness doesn't exist in them. The objects don't exist independent of a self. This system necessarily and naturally others in order to be. I know that's very abstract, but it gives me a way to look at being with others as what democracy was intended to be, I'd argue, which is the ability to negotiate and compromise, as opposed to being right or wrong in some abstract way where I get to pretend like I had nothing to do with what's right. It's just out there, a continuum category. And I'll say one last thing on that. By buying into the idea that I have nothing to do with my othering, I can say things like, yeah, criminals, they belong in jail because they broke the law. And we treat the law as an other that has nothing to do with who we are, despite the fact we create the law, right? And what that does is it allows me, because I can believe that someone is responsible for breaking some Kantian a priori moral category or something like that. The suffering they experience because of their incarceration has nothing to do with me. And then you recognize that rhetorics of othering, that rhetorics of ontologies, of the external moral code, or all this, what it does is allow suffering to occur because I exist, that I can claim doesn't exist because of me, right? And, the war on drugs, right? It has nothing to do with me not wanting certain things. It has everything to do with those people breaking a law. And that rhetoric it allows people to not feel bad when they're in bed at night because of all the people who are suffering in certain ways because of the way they live their life. So Wild Systems isn't there for people who want to walk around happy with a smile in a traditional just bought a new object kind of way, right? It's there for people who can't help themselves and who can't help themselves but feel this way and need to find a way. What I'm doing is I'm offering them a way to experience that as a strength, right? There's a strength that you have. You may not have known it, and we can work to cultivate it. And so, yeah.
Great. Yeah, no, that's a really, the word that comes to mind sort of is love in agape sense, actually, as I sort of, at least in terms of it would be one way of framing sort of the holistic appreciation of the network and our interdependence.
Yes.
Is that fair at some level for? Yeah.
Exactly. And it's easy to buy into otherings that allow me to ignore the suffering of others. And I'm not saying anything new, right? This is centuries old Buddhism. It's simply restating it in a 21st century Western context.
Right. And
that's all from a coherence perspective, that's all philosophy ever really can be.
Right.
So I accept that. And I don't need to be right.
Love
just
maximally
coherent.
Well, it's just meaning is, and here it is.
No, when I met Wayne Hirschberger and I was probably 20, he said, "You want to know what experience is? This is it." And he pointed outside of himself, and I loved it. I didn't know what the hell it meant, but no one had talked to me like that.
Right.
And when I'm in a classroom full of students, or if I happen to be at a bar and people want to talk about this stuff, they've not heard it before. They've not been presented this way of conceptualizing themselves before. And there are a lot of people out there that are looking for different ways to experience themselves. And I'm flattered and delighted when I have the opportunity to blather on as you've let me do
it's been
for a while here.
And from my little angle, it's certainly syncing up with John. We have a meaning and mental health crisis. Our system is in a chaotic, fragmented pluralism. And there are multiple ways where a coherentist, systemic, natural, wild, agape orienting way of being in the world sounds like just about right.
Dude, that was another mic drop there, man. That was exactly the case.
So, hey, man, I really appreciate you coming and sharing your perspective and your embodied wisdom. And it was very nourishing for me at multiple levels. It really was fascinating.
Well, vice versa. Thanks so much for the invitation. Just to let you know, this logo behind me, it's not a good logo because you can't see what it says. It says Dark Loops Productions.
Okay.
So it's a channel on YouTube where I usually use pop culture and get a bunch of experts from different disciplines to talk like we just have, using that pop culture phenomenon as a medium. And the conversations go on for an hour and a half. And, people usually watch the first 30, 40 seconds and jet. But that's not the point. The point is that they're out there in the world.
Right.
And anyone who wants to watch it can, which is a world we didn't live in 20 years ago. So,
and Dark Loops, can you cue us in on that?
Yeah, no, I'll tell you exactly where it came from. The first thing, by the way, I'm just bootstrapping my tech skills as I've done this. But in March of 20, I started my first podcast. It was for season 3 of Westworld.
Oh, okay.
And I had an Italian colleague, Dr. Tommaso Bertoloni, an embodied philosopher, was going to be on the crew. And we were discussing names, and he said, why don't we call ourselves Dark Loops? Because of Westworld, and they're in their loops. Yeah. And the more I thought about it, the more I loved it. Well, he didn't end up appearing on the panel. He's done other stuff later. But Dark Loops is a direct appeal to the dark loops we live in. And it's also kind of an appeal to a 70s vinyl vibe. Right. In other words, when I was a young kid, any Saturday I'd go out to the record store and just flip through album covers and just be fascinated with the artwork, and never had money to buy one, but I just loved that space. And so, consistent with the idea of Zombie Scotty, it's sort of, bringing back, I guess, the childish nostalgia, the wonder of things I encountered when I was younger. Things that also saved me when I was younger. Good lyrics, good novels will introduce you to ways of being that may not be available in your immediate world. So Dark Loops is there as a tribute to 70s vinyl, as well as to a tribute to the dark loops we tend to live in. And my daughter made the logo, so she's now it's very multi-scale.
Very illuminating, if you'll allow the pun.
No, please. I got it. Absolutely.
All righty, friend. That's beautiful. Really appreciate it. Again, let me echo, all your hard work, all your vision, all your embodiment of wisdom. It's a really cool thing to see. I'm really glad we got a chance to share this conversation with a few people that go more than 30 seconds in.
Thank you very much, Greg. Very much
Absolutely.
appreciated.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.